Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here tonight to speak and to ask two questions of the government. And the first one is about the liability for accidents at offshore drilling installations or at nuclear power plants. The liability limits in the case of an accident at an offshore drilling operation are only $30 million in the Atlantic or $40 million in the Arctic. And I think the government would agree with me that these liability limits are too low. These are caps on the amount that a company is liable for in the case of an accident. And the government has hinted that legislation may be forthcoming to increase these limits. And let me just give you a simple illustration of why these limits need to be increased. Current limits are $40 million in the Arctic. The cost of the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico was $40 billion, 1,000 times more than the current liability limits. And I know the government has hinted that some legislation may be forthcoming. And one of my questions today is, when is that legislation forthcoming? Could it not have been introduced in Bill C-60, which has a number of pieces which did not appear in the budget? The second place where liability limits need to be increased is with nuclear power plants. Currently, the liability cap is only $75 million. And I know that this government has introduced legislation in the past. In fact, it has introduced legislation 3 times in the past to raise liability limits on accidents at nuclear power plants from 75 million to something like 650 million or more. And my question to the government is, when we had a minority conservative government, legislation to increase these liability limits was introduced 3 different times. And all 3 bills died for one reason or another, whether it was an early election or prorogation or simply that the bill wasn't advanced by the government. But now that we have a majority conservative government, we've had a majority conservative government for 2 years, I don't understand why the government has not introduced standalone legislation that could be examined carefully and debated. Why couldn't it simply reintroduce legislation that it was willing to introduce in a minority government? And so I challenge the government to explain why it hasn't done so, because I think people will ask, well, you have a majority government now. Did you really want to increase the liability limits when you were a minority government? That's my other question. And the last thing I would say is, in response to my initial question in question period, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Natural Resources answered, and he began with this statement. And speaking for the government, he says, the foundation of our liability regime is the polluter pay principle. Now, I think that's something that perhaps all members of the House could agree on. And my question to the government is, now that this government is spending a lot of time going to the United States to lobby the government there to approve the Keystone XL pipeline and to claim that Canada is strong on environmental protection, my question to the government tonight is, would they extend the polluter pay principle and would they apply it to other things that damage the natural environment, with this idea in mind that they are going to the United States and lobbying the United States government on how they claim to be protecting the natural environment and caring about climate change? And that is my question. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks to the Honourable Member from Kingston and the Islands for asking about financial liabilities regarding Canada's regulatory regimes for nuclear operations and offshore oil and gas activities. Mr. Speaker, the health and safety of Canadians and protecting our environment are the government's top priorities. We recognize that accidents can happen anywhere, regardless of our laws and safety measures. But we're also very confident in our safeguards. We have strong environmental laws and standards and a robust safety regime for offshore exploration and drilling. Oil and gas rigs used in the Canadian offshore industry, as well as the equipment and training required to operate them, must all meet strict regulatory standards that are among the highest in the world. The National Energy Board evaluates each drilling application in the northern offshore for compliance with federal regulations. On the East Coast, the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board and the Canada, Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board have similar responsibilities. Drilling cannot occur unless the responsible board is fully satisfied that drilling plans are safe for workers and the environment. Mr. Speaker, it's important for everyone to understand that when it comes to offshore activities, decisions are made with great care and only after much scrutiny. We have been working closely with the governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia to identify gaps in the current legislation on cost recovery in the offshore. The Accords Acts are the cornerstone for all oil and gas activity offshore. They provide the legal authority for the boards to regulate oil and gas activity on behalf of the provinces. Canada's liability regime is founded on the polluter pays principle. As noted in the recent report by the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, the responsibility rests with operators to immediately take all reasonable measures to clean up a spill and prevent further damage. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes the value of financial assurances as an important tool for protecting the environment and taxpayers. We're taking action to address the Commissioner's recommendations. Work is underway to increase the liabilities required of industry. Our government also intends to modernize the Nuclear Liability Act and increase the operator liability limit to an amount in keeping with international standards. Proposals will be brought forward for updating the legislation in the coming weeks and months. Our government is fully confident that the offshore boards will continue to provide comprehensive oversight of oil and gas operators, and we will continue working with the National Energy Board, the offshore boards, and the provinces and territories to ensure that our regulatory regime remains one of the strongest in the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Mr. Speaker, so my question restated is this, and I know my honourable colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, doesn't need his notes to answer this question. Why has the government, in its 2 years of majority, not been willing to reintroduce the legislation that it introduced 3 times when it was a minority government to increase the liability caps on nuclear power plants? And my second question is it willing to apply the polluter pay principle, which I think we will all agree that it is very good that the foundation of our country's liability regime be the polluter pay principle. Is it willing to apply this when it comes to climate change and greenhouse gases?
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I hope, Mr. Speaker, my colleague listens to the answer, because it's no exaggeration to say that offshore oil and gas sector has transformed the economy of Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks to the royalties and other revenues generated by the industry, Newfoundland and Labrador have become hab provinces and the economic force in our federation for the first time in history. And one of the reasons for its remarkable success in Canada's robust regulatory regime for offshore oil and gas activities. Our regime helps to ensure the highest level of safety, protection of the environment, and management of our petroleum resources. Mr. Speaker, our government takes sustainable development of Canada's natural resources very seriously. That's why offshore oil and gas activities must meet tough standards that are among the highest in the world. Canadian regulators will not allow any drilling to start until they're convinced the environment and the workers will be protected. In the event of a spill, the polluter pay principle is the foundation of our liability regime. Thank you very much.